So without further ado, I want to invite our first speaker, Professor Frances Raday, Professor Emerita from the Hebrew University and currently also teaching at the College of Management. Frances is a great expert in international law, and in the past years she is part of the United Nations Working Group on Women's Rights, the Human Rights Council. There's other titles, honorary degrees from University of Copenhagen. Frances will talk about the international law perspectives of nonviolent resistance. The floor is yours.
Good morning to those of you who are here. A select audience, I take it, and probably you know quite a lot about what I'm going to say, but I think that in recent days we've understood what some of the people who projected into power, people like Orban and Netanyahu, have been saying. You should say things over and over and over again. And so I apologize for those of you who know some of what I'm saying, but I'm going to say it. Well, I'm going to start off, of course, with Israel being the home to a storm of resistance by hundreds of thousands of citizens, with calls for civil disobedience by political and professional elites, including former prime ministers, high-tech startup leaders, special forces operators, operatives, pilots, doctors, academics. This, for me, has been the only encouraging thing that we have seen since November 22 and even before November 22. Well, they are focusing on the plans of the extreme, they call themselves right-wing, full right-wing government, and to curtail, and this is what I think we must remember in any discussion, in any partisan plan to so-called legal reform, the whole plan is to curtail the power of the Supreme Court in a bid to remove the checks and balances that restrict this government's absolute power. The aim is absolute power, and it's one of the things I'll go through because it's very important when we're talking about democracy. The members of the governing coalition and its supporters accuse these resistant movements of betraying democracy by seditiously opposing the agenda of a democratically elected parliamentary majority. And this is the message that is going through to a significant portion of the population. This is the really difficult message that we have to try and cope with. This message, we got a majority, 64 against 56. You are the anti-democrats. You are seditious. Your resistance is seditious. And so we have to really ask ourselves, where does sorry. I shall turn it off altogether, obviously. Sorry, silence it. Sorry. Where does democratic legitimacy lie? Oops, sorry. Okay. Where does in this scenario, this dichotomy of perspectives which are clashing, where does democratic legitimacy lie? Well, ex priori, the claim that winning a parliamentary majority in an election is per se a guarantee of democracy for all that majority does is, of course, false and manipulative. There's a very good research done by a professor called Kim Lane Chepele, and she puts it in her, her comparative research is called autocratic legislation, autocratic legalism, in which she compares Poland, Hungary, Russia, Turkey, Venezuela. She recently gave a talk on these countries on her comparative research, and throughout, she dotted in what's happening in Israel at the moment. In all of these countries, and in Israel at the moment, there's what's called intolerant majoritarianism, masquerading as democracy, led by new autocrats who first came to power through elections and then translated their victories into what they call illiberal constitutionalism. I hate that term. It's far too soft a term. It's despotic constitutionalism. Well, I want to look at three things. Firstly, how we look at democratic legitimacy in international law. Secondly, whether the Israeli government has lost democratic legitimacy already. Thirdly, do we go for compromise or resistance? And what is the legitimacy of resistance? So I'll go through those three things. Firstly, the loss of democratic legitimacy in international law. Well, you can deduce this from what the components of democracy are in international law, and I rely particularly on the General Assemblies promoting and consolidating democracy as one of the sources of talking about what are the components of democracy in international law. But firstly, I have to say, why do I turn to international law? Where there is constitutional collapse, as there is when the elected majority decides to overturn the constitution and introduce autocratic government, then turning to the internal law is not very helpful. You need standards which you can look at. And in her comparative research, after a long article, in the end, Shepley turns to international law. She's not an international lawyer. She's a political scientist. She turns to international law. So when we look at international law sources, what are the demands for a democracy? Well, there is consensus that underlies all the sources, any constitutional discussion of separation of powers. And we've heard a lot from the camp that understands that this is not legitimate behavior of a democratic government, that the undermining of separation of powers is fatal. Legislature, executive, and the judiciary. And I repeat that Israel is already in a very fragile position as regards this, because executive and legislature are not independent sources of authority. They are not separated powers in Israel. So the only remaining branch of government, which is a separate authority, is the judicial authority. And that is why the undermining of the judicial authority of the judicial branch is so, is one blow step to authoritarianism, is a one blow step to authoritarianism. This is the most immediate target, indeed, of the present government. And it is therefore also the main point of resistance of those who are resisting the plans of the incoming government. But beyond that, and this is the Shepley political science approach, she says one of the main things, and also drawing on international law, is the potential for changing government through free and fair elections. And this is very clear in international law, that part of democracy is not only having gained power through free and fair elections, but being able to change your government through free and fair elections. It's no surprise that the new autocracies, the liberal and democratic constitutionalism, that they are attacking the basic principles of liberal and democratic constitutionalism. And this, I quote her, and I'm quoting all these: Venezuela, Turkey, Poland, Hungary, Russia, the places that we really do not want to live according to their lights. And she points out they want to consolidate power and entrench themselves in office for the long haul. And of course, unsurprisingly, the agenda of the coalition to reduce the voting power of the Arab minority fits the bill. So that's the second. So the separation of powers, the potential for changing government through free and fair elections, are both parts of the legitimacy of democratic government. And third, according to international law sources, and this is more in contention in the Israeli, even the academic discourse, but it's in international law, it seems very clear. Democratic governments requires respect for all human rights and for the rule of law without corruption in political or public office. It requires guaranteeing the rights of minorities and of women and LGBTI to full equality. It requires freedom of association, right to freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and other major civil rights, as well as promoting the activities of human rights defenders. And all these, of course, are part and parcel of the potential for free and fair elections in the future. Israel's government falls short on all these indicators, as is proven in its coalition agreement and in its package of 151 bills, which include proposals to limit freedom of expression, to allow discrimination on grounds of religious conviction in the provision of services to the public, to severely restrict the activities of human rights defenders. It is these human rights which secure the potential for ongoing democracy. In previous attempts to restrict the activities of the human rights defenders through requiring transparency of foreign funding, if you remember, the Concord Institute, which I direct, took to court an amicus opinion on the international human rights approach. And under the Declaration on the Rights of Human Rights on human rights defenders, the General Assembly clearly pointed out that you have to promote human rights defenders and not obstruct them. And amongst other things, you have to allow foreign funding. It's explicitly stated. And when we see it explicitly stated in the UN General Assembly's declaration, we understand that authoritarian governments, this is one of their ways of totally squashing, excluding, eliminating human rights defenders. So those are the things, the three things that I think are really come from the international law conceptualization of democracy: separation of powers, the ongoing right to change government through free and fair elections, and protection of the human rights of those who are not the majority: minorities, women, LGBTI, and so on. So that's now coming to what's Israel. Has Israel lost its democratic legitimacy? The government's lost its democratic legitimacy. Well, having gained a small parliamentary majority, the government is hellbound on guaranteeing itself absolute power, free of constitutional review. I think it is quite clear that both by rhetoric, both by attempted legislation, and by some of the budgetary and appointments activity that are going on behind the scenes of this attempted legal reform, in inverted commas, I think that it's quite clear that the Israeli government has lost its democratic legitimacy. We know that it's attempting to amend the constitutional basis of the Israeli legal system, politicize the appointment of judges, legislate an override clause in which high court judgments can be overturned by a simple majority of the Knesset, limit the power of the courts in review amendments to the basic law, to review amendments in the basic laws, cancel judicial review of governmental decisions on grounds of extreme unreasonableness, which you've all heard plenty about. I think, I don't know, I certainly go into it further if anybody wants, but I think just listing them, you see this gross undermining of the separation of powers, of the possibility of implementing human rights, and of the future possibility of free and fair elections. Their claim up till now that Israel has been subject to dictatorship of the courts and the legal advisors to government is patently false and manipulative. And I won't go into it. Anybody wants to ask me, I'm prepared to discuss it. The despotic agenda of the government goes far beyond the legal establishment. It extends to politicization of the police, already well on the way to being carried out, if not already carried out, undermining the autonomy of the media, already well on the way to being carried out, if not already carried out, undermining the independence of academic institutions of research, which has failed temporarily, but is on its way. Having co-opted the trade unions, we see the Histadrut's silence in the face of measures that are clearly going to harm organized labor, and they don't deny it, but they will not take a stand against it. Shutting down the public broadcaster, which they haven't quite yet done, though a lot of the people who are on it seem to have been co-opted already. Politicizing the Central Bureau of Statistics, which they haven't quite done yet, but you see where they're going. They want to make sure that the facts are their facts. And so on all these levels, you see autocracy, which despotism, which is in no way does not deserve to be called democratically legitimate. How we get that through to those who think that 64 members of the parliament are all that it requires for democratic legitimacy is another question. Now, what are the true goals? Sorry, 5 more minutes is fine. What are the true goals? The true goals are 3. I call it not a triumvirate, the coalition, but rather a chimera, the three-headed monster of Greek mythology. It is to allow corruption with impunity, to allow settlement of the West Bank, not settlement, annexation of the West Bank with apartheid, and to allow a purely halakhic state which overrides universal human rights. All these 3 aims are patently anti-democratic. In the face of this tyrannical majority, the liberal camp is divided between those who call for dialogue and compromise and those who regard resistance as the only possible option to defend Israel as a democratic state. The dialogue and compromise camp was led by President Yitzhak Herzog, and it failed. It failed not because there was no willingness to compromise, but on the substance, demonstrating the impossibility of opposing a bid for unrestricted power with good intentions and constitutional argument. The call, now, to hear Herzog's speech in America yesterday was, I mean, either you have to have a very strong sense of humor and laugh, or you are in agony listening to the misrepresentation. The call, but on a more conceptual level, the call for wide consensus to exit the constitutional collapse and provide some sort of alternative constitutional basis for judicial independence and a Bill of Human Rights is an oxymoron. What do we mean consensus? There are international human rights which are guaranteed to the minority and the individual against any wide consensus, however wide that consensus may be. And I know this is what they call in Hebrew a plonter, how we get out of that, but certainly I find this call for a wide consensus ignorant in terms of the international, since 1948, the international regime of human rights, which is anti-consensus. It is pro-minority and individual. It is anti-consensus. Nevertheless, as I said, Herzog is going on his way. The Israel Civil Democracy Movement, of whose legal team I'm a member, has called on the president instead to acknowledge the utter lack of agreement and to declare that he will not sign any laws that constitute regime change. Obviously, there's no hope for that, but hearing him yesterday and knowing who he is, but we do call upon him to do that. Now, the last point I want to make is the only alternative at this point is resistance. And what do we learn from international law and theory about resistance? There are forms of resistance which are fully legal, such as peaceful demonstration, general protest strike, refusal to volunteer for service in the army or the government. There is also policy-based, civil disobedient disobedience which involves breaking the law to change such governmental policy as is seen as dangerously wrong. Of course, Rosa Parks sitting at the front of the bus is the classic example from American history. When democratically elected government has lost democratic legitimacy, blocking roads, train stations, and the airport, withholding of taxes, refusal to comply with mandates of gender or racial segregation, or demonstrations contrary to any new restrictions, which certainly will be imposed to restrict the rights of assembly, all of these are legitimate, even if they are illegal. And I would say refusal of army service, and certainly selective refusal to serve in the territories in view of the policy of annexation and apartheid are clearly legitimate, though of course they do bear the sanction of the law. And so long as as this government has not backed down on its despotism. The former Prime Minister and Chief of Staff Ehud Barak and lawmaker Yair Golan have called for civil disobedience, and they're accused by members of government, of the coalition, of sedition. I want to point out that sedition is a vague offense of incitement to rebel against the authority of the state. It has been criticized by UN experts as a weapon used by governments in order to violate freedom of expression. Indeed, the accusation of sedition fits well into the pattern of tyranny, which is the hallmark of the regime change being slammed by the government through the Knesset. On these ideas of resistance, the Concord Institute also took an amicus brief based on international law when the previous Netanyahu government was trying to block demonstrations outside Balfour Street on grounds that you had to demonstrate within 1 kilometer of home because of COVID restrictions, because of corona restrictions. We went to court and we showed that various UN experts have come out during the COVID epidemic saying that one must allow demonstrations during COVID and not use COVID as an excuse for limiting political demonstrations. First. Second, you must allow demonstrations which are political to take place within sight and sound of the target of those demonstrations. So these were helpful interpretations in international law, which we took to court and which the judges did repeat and seem to pay attention to. Well, I'm finishing with one sentence. The third alternative is submission. And it's crucial not to submit, to prevent the irreversible destruction of Israel's institutions of democracy, and with them, the economic, strategic, and defense foundations of Israel's survival. I lectured in Berlin, and we were compared constantly to Hungary and Poland. I said, Hungary and Poland have a choice between being democratic or not democratic. Israel has a choice between to be and not to be. Mass protest seems at the moment the way for concerned citizens to defend their state. I hope that we will succeed.